Now, many of you might know that I've not always been Nintendo's biggest fan. I've been critical of them in recent times, especially some of their less than stellar games such as Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, which released as a bug-ridden mess and since then hasn't really been fixed. Bayonetta 3 was a very ambitious game that had significant performance issues that kind of took me out of the experience and enjoyment of that game. And I even had concerns about Tears of the Kingdom. Not that I believed that it wouldn't be a great game. For me, Tears of the Kingdom had me worried that Nintendo may not be able to pull off the same trick twice in the generation, and a sequel is always a risky move. Now, the preview event that happened a few weeks ago and the gameplay reveals that we saw felt like it would be kind of more of the same, but with some updates in key areas, especially when it came to crafting, all around the same map of Hyrule. It looked cool, but would it be enough to pull me back into the world of Hyrule for another turn this generation? Well, I needn't have worried because Tears of the Kingdom is fantastic. Now, I know we use the term a lot sometimes, but this is the real deal, and possibly the very best Zelda game that I've played since Link to the Past all those years ago. Now, to be very clear, I can't make the determination about this as this is not a definitive review because I only just picked up the game and I've played about 10 hours. So these are my kind of initial thoughts and impressions, but initial thoughts and impressions are very positive. Now, finishing this game is going to take a very, very long time. And let me tell you, I'm in really no hurry to do so. So with all that, let's talk about the game so far and why I think it's amazing and why I think you should check it out. Now, I'm going to keep this as spoiler-free as possible, but I do want to talk about some of the parts of the game, including the intro sequence that sets up the story. It's absolutely brilliant, and immediately you'll notice how good the graphics look, but we'll get to that later. Link begins with a Master Sword and a fully maxed out health bar, but after an initial encounter with Ganon, who comes back to life, is stripped of all his powers and the Master Sword. Now, I gotta say that I'm not a big fan of that video game trope where your powers are completely stripped away Metroid style, only for you to kind of recover them. But in Tears of the Kingdom, it absolutely makes sense. Now, at this point is where the adventure really begins, and you start on the Great Sky Island, and this particular island is massive. And initially you might be thinking to yourself, is this the actual game map? Well, no, it's only one of the islands in the sky. And you start out with no powers and only a small amount of health. And this is somewhat of the starter area for you to explore and get familiar with the game mechanics and controls. It's also the area where you quickly learn that shrines are back in the game. And I'm told, or at least I've read, that there's like 120 of them, maybe even more in the actual game itself, which is a lot. And it's also the first area where you'll start to get some of the powers that we saw in the preview event: Ultra Hand, Ascend, and Fuse. These effectively are the kind of crafting and traversal mechanics that Nintendo has showed us that brings a new dimension to the experience. Now, of course, you can just say that these are here to appease the die-hard Zelda fans who didn't connect with Breath of the Wild thanks to the destructible weapons and difficult terrain to explore, especially when the first game felt like it was raining all the time. And I gotta be honest, one of my initial concerns with Ultra Hand was I felt like the game would rely on it too heavily as the only solution to get past a puzzle. Sometimes I just want to play, not have to build shit to move from point A to point B. And initially, on the Great Sky Island, because most of your powers and items are missing, you indeed have to rely on Ultra Hand and Ascend especially to get around, and this did have me worried for the game proper. However, once you complete the Great Sky Island is when the game really begins to open up, and holy hell, the first things you'll notice when you jump from the sky is the draw distance is improved significantly with very little texture pop and stutter, and the tech here has seen significant improvements from Breath of the Wild. And when you traverse around the landscape, not only does the game look a lot sharper than you remember, but it's also very fluid with a stable frame rate, at least as far as first impressions go. Now, before you leave the Great Sky Island, you'll pick up a fourth skill known as Recall, and this allows you to move objects in the reverse direction that they arrive from. This is a pretty important skill to have, and one that I've used a ton throughout the game. And so far during my playthrough, I might add, there are additional skills that I've yet to find. And these new abilities make the shrines a ton of fun. I never really connected with them in Breath of the Wild, other than something that you needed to do to grind in order to get heart pieces. In Tears, shrines are so much more fun and accessible, and I look forward to them every time I stumble across a new one. So far, I've completed about 20 of them or so, and all of them were enjoyable, and in many cases, there's not only one single way to beat one. I didn't record it unfortunately, but one shrine required you to build a vehicle that could be mounted on rails that you had to stand on to get to the other side. Basically what I did was I just walked along the path of the rail ever so carefully and finished it that way. And it's these different ways to solve problems that make the game so fun and so accessible. We also need to talk about the story. In Breath of the Wild, the story wasn't as front and center as it is here in Tears. I'm personally someone who needs to be connected with the story at all times, and in Breath of the Wild it was too easy to get lost in the weeds a little. This time around, expect much longer cutscenes with excellent pacing as well. Now once again, I'm only 10 or so hours in, and I have a ton of questions, but I fully expect that the story will get fleshed out and answered as I progress. So the question on everyone's mind is dungeons, and yes, I'm using air quotes when I say the word dungeons. They are back in the game, but rather they are called temples, and I feel like the word temple is a bit of a nod to temples that were in Ocarina of Time. However, to be clear, these still aren't traditional Zelda dungeons that you might be expecting. For example, there's no dungeon key that unlocks the door to the final boss. Rather, you are given a single objective that has different parts to get through, and once you get past that, then comes the boss encounter. I've already beaten one temple already, and while I can tell you that this is not a Divine Beast layout, it's not really a traditional Zelda dungeon either. Now, another new surprising game mechanic that was added to Tears of the Kingdom was you can now have companions in the game that will team up and fight with you after you've beaten certain temples in the game. And already, I can see how useful they are, not only to get around the map, but also to help you out in combat, especially if you're in a bit of a pinch. They will go in there and fight with you, and they usually do a pretty good job. Now, I'm still not quite sure how many of these companions you'll actually end up that fight alongside of you, but this is just another really cool addition to the game. Now, I want to talk about the sound and audio design because it's incredible. One of my favorite parts of the game. It all fits together perfectly. This isn't a big thing, but I do want to call it out. Take a listen to the splash sound when Link hits the water from diving from the sky. It sounds absolutely perfect. The rain and thunderclapping effects also sound top-notch as well. Tears of the Kingdom will certainly be in the conversation for Game of the Year this year, but I also hope that it gets a nod for Best Audio Design as well, because it's just that good. And that's what makes Tears of the Kingdom so incredible. The open world is truly remarkable. It's massive in size, and I can already tell you that it's a much larger open world than Breath of the Wild. And then a whole entire underground section that I have yet to stumble across, which I'm told is just as big as Hyrule itself. This is a massive, massive game, and I'm in absolutely no hurry to get through this game. It's going to take me hundreds of hours, and I'm here for the entire ride. And sometimes it's easy to forget that all this is running on 7-year-old aging Switch hardware. And with that, it's a perfect segue to go into some tech talk. The resolution of the game is running at up to 900p in docked and 720p in handheld and targeting 30 frames per second. But this time around, Nintendo decided to apply FSR1 to the visuals. Now, of course, FSR1 is a good solution, but it does come with some side effects. For example, notice the shimmering in the shrines here. It's quite noticeable, and sometimes it's quite distracting. Now, the other thing that I want to mention is, even though the 1.1 patch did appear a few days just before the launch of the game, which does indeed address many of the frame rate issues that were being talked about during the preview event, it's not perfect, and in some parts of the game later on, particularly the temples that I've been to, really do start to tax performance. For example, at one of the temples, I noticed that the frame rate does start to drop quite significantly. This boss encounter, for example, drops quite noticeably to around 20 frames per second. So I just want to make mention of this because there is a bit of a narrative going on that the 1.1 patch has cleared up all the frame rate issues, but that is simply not true. Different parts of the game, especially during the temple sections, do have noticeable frame rate drops. But I do want to be clear that this is not sustained frame drops. This is something that does correct itself pretty quickly soon after. But overall, we're talking about 7-year-old handheld hardware, and I guess we shouldn't really complain. However, I have been thinking about doing some overclocking tests on Tears of the Kingdom, so I may actually end up making a video on that over the weekend. If you guys are interested in seeing how performance of Tears of the Kingdom is on a hack switch with overclocking, then let me know in the comments below. I'll probably end up doing something for a video on that at some point here in the future. I do hope that whatever hardware does come next from Nintendo, that Tears of the Kingdom will see an improvement to its graphical fidelity and its frame rate. Visually, Tears of the Kingdom looks fine, but imagine it running at 1440p or even 4K at high resolutions with high frame rates. Here's hoping that someday we'll get to see that. After all, Breath of the Wild began its life as a Wii U title, so I'm hoping that Tears of the Kingdom will end up on new Nintendo hardware in the not so distant future. And with that, we are going to leave it here for today's episode. Make no mistake, Zelda is back and everyone should check it out, and hopefully you're playing it today on launch day. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. But with that, we're going to leave it here for today's episode, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, please don't forget to leave me a thumbs up, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye for now.